The conflict between America and Afghanistan stands as one of the longest and most complex wars of the modern era, beginning in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks and stretching on for 2 decades with shifting strategies, changing goals, and countless human costs. At its core, the war started as a direct response by the United States against al-Qaeda, the militant group responsible for the attacks, and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that had provided them safe haven. The initial objective seemed simple: dismantle terrorist networks, eliminate Osama bin Laden, and prevent Afghanistan from being used again as a launching pad for global terrorism. But as the years went on, the scope of the mission expanded, the strategies evolved, and the realities on the ground created a conflict that tested military strength, political will, and human endurance on both sides. The early stages of the war demonstrated America's overwhelming military capabilities. Within weeks of launching Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001, U.S. forces, supported by NATO allies and local Afghan groups like the Northern Alliance, toppled the Taliban government in Kabul. Precision airstrikes, advanced surveillance technologies, and rapid deployment of ground troops showcased the technological superiority of the American military. The Taliban were forced to retreat into rural strongholds and across the border into Pakistan. At this stage, the war was widely perceived as successful, with minimal American casualties compared to the scale of Taliban losses and the Afghan people initially expressed hope for a new chapter with the promise of rebuilding institutions, infrastructure, and democratic governance. However, the design of the conflict quickly shifted from a short-term military campaign into a long-term nation-building effort. The U.S. and its allies faced the enormous challenge of creating stability in a country fractured by tribal divisions, poverty, corruption, and decades of war. Billions of dollars were invested in rebuilding schools, roads, hospitals, and government structures. But these efforts often struggled against systemic corruption, weak governance, and the persistent insurgency of the Taliban, who regrouped and gradually regained influence in rural areas. America's technological advantage could secure cities and key installations, but it could not easily dismantle networks of guerrilla fighters who relied on knowledge of the terrain, local support, and hit-and-run tactics that drained U.S. resources and morale over time. Performance on the battlefield was marked by a contrast between America's ability to conduct high-tech operations and the Taliban's resilience through low-tech but highly adaptive strategies. American forces deployed drones, satellite surveillance, advanced aircraft, and precision-guided munitions that allowed them to eliminate targets with accuracy and minimal exposure to direct combat. Special Forces operations and intelligence-led missions played a key role in weakening al-Qaeda and eventually locating and killing Osama bin Laden in 2011 in neighboring Pakistan, a major symbolic and strategic victory for the U.S. Yet the Taliban demonstrated remarkable endurance, relying on roadside bombs, ambushes, and control of rural territory to gradually undermine American progress. Their use of improvised explosive devices became one of the deadliest tactics against American and coalition troops, highlighting how asymmetrical warfare could level the playing field. Despite massive differences in resources and technology, one of the defining design elements of the war was its dual nature. On the one hand, a counter-terrorism mission aimed at destroying specific threats, and on the other, a counterinsurgency and nation-building mission requiring long-term commitments. The U.S. attempted to train and equip Afghan security forces to take over the defense of their country, spending vast sums to create a modern army and police force. In theory, this strategy would allow America to eventually withdraw without leaving a vacuum. In practice, however, the Afghan forces often suffered from poor leadership, lack of motivation, corruption, and dependence on American logistical and air support. This design flaw became painfully clear in 2021, when the US finally withdrew and the Afghan army collapsed within weeks, allowing the Taliban to retake Kabul almost without resistance. From a strategic perspective, the war revealed both strengths and limitations of American military power. On one hand, the US demonstrated that it could project force rapidly and dominate conventional battles. On the other, the war exposed how difficult it is to win against an insurgency rooted in local culture, history, and geography. Performance metrics such as territory held, enemy combatants killed, or infrastructure built often failed to capture the underlying political and social dynamics that determined whether peace and stability could last. America's reliance on military solutions sometimes overshadowed the need for long-term political reconciliation among Afghans, and this imbalance became one of the war's critical challenges. The war also carried unique selling points in terms of lessons for both military and political leadership worldwide. For the US, it became a case study in the limits of nation-building, the complexities of asymmetric warfare, and the dangers of mission creep. For Afghanistan, it highlighted the struggle between modernization and tradition, as well as the importance of sovereignty and resilience in the face of foreign intervention. For the world, it served as a reminder of how deeply interconnected global security is, where events in one country can have ripple effects across continents, shaping policies, migration, and geopolitics for decades. Human cost remains the most profound and tragic element of the war. Tens of thousands of Afghan civilians lost their lives, millions were displaced, and generations grew up in an environment of conflict and instability. For the US and coalition forces, thousands of soldiers were killed, and many more returned with lasting physical and psychological wounds. The war drained trillions of dollars from the American economy, funds that could have been invested domestically but instead were funneled into sustaining a conflict that had no clear endgame. Meanwhile, ordinary Afghans bore the brunt of shifting strategies and broken promises, often caught between Taliban intimidation and foreign military operations. In the end, the legacy of the America-Afghanistan War is one of contradictions. It began with swift victories and global unity, but over time it morphed into a protracted struggle that revealed deep flaws in strategy and execution. It showcased both the power and the limits of modern military technology. It brought moments of progress, such as advances in education for Afghan women and improvements in infrastructure. But those gains were fragile and in many cases reversed when the Taliban returned to power. It highlighted how wars are not only fought with weapons but also with ideas, governance, and legitimacy. And in those areas, America faced challenges that sheer firepower could not overcome. It remains a conflict that will be studied for decades by historians, strategists, and policymakers, not only for what it says about Afghanistan, but for what it reveals about America's role in the world and the nature of modern warfare.